By the time we found the locket, evening light had gone the color of old honey. It lay half hidden in the needles beside a wind-scoured boulder, the hinge silted with dust, the chain snapped clean. When I pried it open, a tiny photograph blinked up through a film of grit, Leora's smile bright as a creek in July, and a single dark strand of hair that had held its curl through years of weather. A jay scolded from the firs. The ridge wind lifted and fell. Nothing else moved. Let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I have lived my whole adult life where the river braids past Hamilton and the Bitterroots stand like a wall against the western sky. Back in the summer of 2001, my days were measured the same way every week: coffee at 6 morning headlines at the KRVL radio booth by 7, a slow drive down US 93, where hayfields threw off that sweet green smell. By noon, the asphalt shimmered, and the mountains seemed closer than they were the way they do when heat stacks in the valley. Evenings ran gentle porch lights, winking on one-by-one dogs announcing the mailman's sprinklers ticking across small lawns. It was an ordinary peace, the kind you only know you had once it's gone. Mira Kine's porch was 3 steps from mine, white railing pots of geraniums staked with little bamboo sticks, a wind chime made out of mismatched spoons from yard sales. We'd talk across that thin gap between our places, the way people do when fences are more suggestion than rule. She kept her hair in a loose twist that always seemed to be coming undone, and wore a silver ring with a turquoise stone that spun on her finger whenever she was thinking. She worked afternoons at the public library, then shelving returns and ordering large print westerns for the regulars. Sundays she made lentil soup that tasted better a day later, and she'd send a jar over with a paper note clipped to the lid for your late shift. Her handwriting leaned forward like it wanted to get you where you were going. Leora, her girl, was motion in human form. If you were downtown on a Saturday, you'd see her at the farmer's market holding an armful of sunflowers or pedaling a clattery 10-speed with a canvas bag beating against her hip. She had a laugh you could pick out of a room quick, surprised clean. That summer, she'd just finished her degree up in Bozeman and moved back for a while to hunt for a job that let her live outside as much as possible. It wasn't unusual to spot her at the trailhead before breakfast, tying her boots in that careful double knot she'd learned after a bad ankle sprain in high school. She kept bear spray holstered on her hip, a whistle on a cord around her neck, and a folded topo map smoothed tight in a Ziploc, the way hikers around here did long before phones tried to do the thinking for us. Hamilton's mood in July is busy but loose. The rodeo posters go up on power poles, and the kids practicing barrel turns leave a small comet of dust behind them wherever they go. Real estate flyers warp in their plastic sleeves under the sun. Gas is cheaper before the tourists pour through. The river moves fast enough that the fishermen keep their feet planted. At night, big irrigation pumps kick on in the hayfields and make a low, constant hum. And always behind everything, those mountains breathing their cool breath down the long, warm valley. Leora ran on a schedule that didn't look like a schedule until you watched it long enough. Monday, she'd help Mira reorganize the hall closet and then head out to the river trail for 4 miles. Tuesday, she'd drive one town over to visit a friend who had a new baby and bring back a pan of lasagna she'd traded for an afternoon of laundry folding. Wednesday was the grocery run 2 miles there in the Jeep, 2 miles back the same way, always stopping at the feed store to scratch the barn cat through the screen door. Thursdays, if you woke up about 6, you'd find her on Shadow Ridge, that steady 8-mile loop above the creek, where the switchbacks are cut smart, and the reward is a view, like a postcard, a ribbon of water, a scatter of roofs, fields laid out in rectangles lit up like a quilt. She'd be home by noon, showered, grinning, the kitchen radio turned up low, while she put together sandwiches with tomato slices thick as 3/4 and a smear of mustard that stung your nose. There is a specific sound to mornings in our part of Montana when the air is 55 degrees and the sun hits the metal roofs like a coin flip. The magpies start first. Then the neighbor's chainsawing chokes to life. 2 streets over, then someone's screen door slaps and the bus brakes wheeze out front of the elementary school. That's the sound I hear when I think about that week. It is benign and unremarkable, and it held the last hours of a life we all thought we understood. Mira raised Leora with a light hand, a steady voice, and a few rules that weren't up for debate. Check in before you hit the trail. Never leave a stove on unattended. Carry cash tucked in your sock. Keep your gas above a quarter tank. Winter makes a fool of people who flirt with empty. They were a two-person household that ran like a small, efficient shop, bills paid on time, porch-swept smoke alarm batteries changed in October, whether they screamed for it or not. Ever since her husband died on an icy highway when Leora was 12, Mira had done everything slow and right, the way you do when you're standing on a floor that once dropped out from under you. I remember a small scene that summer so ordinary I have to lean in to hear it again. It's a Tuesday, late afternoon. Heat's resting heavy on the street. A thunderhead threatens way out over the Selway. Mira and I are splitting a cantaloupe on my back steps, and Leora swings by, helmet clipped to her handlebars, face flushed. She hands Mira a postcard from the visitor kiosk at the Shadow Ridge lot. Wildflowers are a riot this week, and kisses her mother's cheek like she's been doing it her whole life. She pulls a small spiral notebook from the cargo pocket of those trail pants she lived in, tears out a page, and asks if I'll announce the senior center bake sale after my weather update. There is a smear of raspberry jam across the back of her hand. When she smiles, a dimple shows up in her left cheek that isn't in the right. She laughs because the cantaloupe is so ripe it slips right off the rind and onto the porch boards. If you'd asked me then what mattered about any of that, I'd have said nothing. I know better now. Evenings on our block follow a ritual shaped by years of repetition. Sprinklers kick on. A kid with a skateboard rattles past and apologizes for the noise, though he doesn't have to. The last run to Albertsons sends a few sedans down our street with headlights soft as a sigh. Dogs say hello to the same dogs in the same yards. Porch lights rise in a wave, yellow, 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 down to the corner. By 9, voices drop low, and the smell of cut grass gives way to hot pine pitch and whatever dinner was 2 hours ago. That Tuesday, Mira carried a basket of folded towels up from her basement and set them on the sofa. Then stood a moment with her back to the window, head tilted, listening the way someone listens when they know a familiar step. She shook it off, smiled at me, and asked if I needed more soup jars back. I told her to keep them as long as she wanted. She said she'd need them this weekend. Leora was thinking of making peach jam. Shadow Ridge isn't remote the way some trails are out here. The trailhead's a 15-minute drive from town if you catch both lights. You can still see porch roofs if you turn just right on the upper switchbacks. It's popular enough on Saturdays that people learn each other's dogs by name. Local hikers know the mile markers by heart, first at the creek crossing second, under the lightning-struck fir third, where the ground goes soft and you can catch a moose track if it rained the night before. There's a fork at the top, barely a fork at all. Really, a lean left toward the overlook and a short right down toward a ravine choked with brush where the cold hangs even in August. Folks who've logged miles up there walk the left in their sleep. The right takes stubborn pants and a reason. Leora carried reasons for most things. She picked up wrappers left their first week in the dirt and carried them out. She logged trail conditions on a tablet no bigger than her palm and later emailed them to the rangers with a neat list of windfalls and muddy spots. She didn't scold. She didn't grandstand. She just took care. If a stranger asked for directions, she could pull the whole loop up in her head and drop a pin with her finger in the air. 8 miles, she'd say, give or take. 4 up, 4 down if you count the flats. Water's moving fast by the second bridge. Keep your kid tight. She used kid for anyone under 20 and sir for men in feed caps who were younger than she realized. People liked her because she noticed them and then forgot to notice whether they liked her back. On any given morning, you could pick her out by the way she moved, strong but efficient, neither rushing nor wandering. She placed her feet with the care of someone who has been taught by injury and snow and ice. She kept pace with her breath. She stopped not when the view demanded it, but when the birds did. She'd tilt her head like a pointer at the first call of a warbler and smile without looking at anyone. If the canyon carried a hawk's shadow across the path, she'd raise an arm and let it pass over her skin, the way a person might hold still for a summer rain. I think now about the manners of small towns, the micro-courtesies we exchange like currency. The bank teller remembers your brother's birthday. You put your cart back even if the wind is up. You give the right-of-way at the four-way stop to the rancher pulling a flatbed because he's hauling half a mile of steel fence. That summer was thick with those gestures, quiet promises that the world would keep behaving. We met the mail at the curb and said thank you. We waved into the driver's side windows of trucks full of hay. We counted on certain headlights turning into certain driveways at certain times. I kept a small spiral notepad in my breast pocket every shift, same as always, and wrote down the day's tiny weather, 87 degrees by 3 north breeze at 6 mph, smoke faint on horizon. I wrote, too, that the river had dropped 1.5 feet since the snow melt, that the osprey nest on the power pole by the feed store now had 2 heads peering over the rim. On the back page, I jotted a to-do list that looked like 1,000 other lists: call in the school supply drive, find the lost Boston Terrier, a home record, the Civic Theater spot. If you'd pulled those pages out and fanned them like playing cards, you'd have seen our whole summer laid down in pencil, the safe hum of us. The week before the trail became a line we couldn't cross, Mira, and I sat on her steps while the sky did its long Montana dusk, a slow pour of light over the far ridges. A breeze came up cooler than it had any right to be and clacked the spoons on her wind chime. Leora stepped out and tied a bandana at the curve of her neck, the way hikers do to keep sun off the nape. She checked the bear spray canister with her thumb, then tapped the whistle to hear the faint click against her collarbone. She held her map up to the kitchen light, squinted, and slid it into the Ziploc with the practiced press that squeezes out every air bubble. Back before dinner, she called over her shoulder, half to her mother, half to the house itself. The screen door puffed and clicked shut. Here is the first hairline crack I can see now that I couldn't see. Then Mira didn't answer right away. She listened. Not because she doubted not, because she feared just a half-second of listening like you do when a familiar piece of music shifts one note and you wonder if the guitarist meant it. Then she said, "Okay," and smiled, and touched the turquoise ring, turning it once. Late in July, the afternoons go amber around here and stay that way for an hour that feels like 2. That evening, a storm teased miles away and did nothing more than make the light dramatic. I finished my second newscast and gathered my papers into a stack too tidy for what they were. I drove home at 25 miles an hour because the one-eyed dog on second likes to sleep in the road and you have to watch for him. When I parked, the valley had started to cool. Porch lights were coming on. Somewhere, a grill lid clanged shut. Mira's porch light lit early and stayed on. A moth tapped the glass, then another. In the kitchen, I could see her shape pass by the window, then come back, then pause with a hand on the sill. The little wind chime quivered and stilled. Down the block, a set of headlights crested, idled, and turned into a driveway that wasn't theirs. The clock on my microwave slid from 8:13 to 8:14 with a digital click that felt louder than it should. I set my keys in the bowl by the door, leaned a palm against the cool of the hallway wall, and listened to the quiet lay itself down across the street like a blanket. The phone on my counter did not ring. The corner of Shadow Ridge, barely a dark thumbprint on the evening sky, held its breath, and the porch light next door kept burning steady as a vow. I remember that night for its sound, or rather for the moment the sounds stopped. The highway traffic faded, the sprinklers on our block clicked off, and all that was left was that one porch light burning next door, moths spinning through its halo. Mira's silhouette was framed in her kitchen window, a still shape with one hand on the glass waiting for the familiar growl of an old Jeep that never came. I told myself she was probably fine. I even said it out loud, though no one was there to hear me. By 9:30, the quiet had turned from comfortable to wrong. When the phone finally rang, it wasn't her voice. It was Mira's, steady but thin, asking if I'd seen her daughter's headlights come up the drive. I hadn't. We both listened to the line breathe for a few seconds before she said she was calling the sheriff. Morning in the valley came up gold and slow like it always does, but that day the air already carried a tension that didn't belong to sunrise. I drove to Mira's place with a thermos of coffee and found her on the porch in the same clothes she'd worn the night before. The phone cord ran through the screen door like a tether. She told me the deputy said not to panic, that hikers sometimes misjudge daylight. Maybe she camped off trail. But Mira's jaw tightened. Leora was punctual to a fault. She kept her watch 5 minutes fast just to be early. That was the kind of detail only a mother remembers. By noon, the Ravalli County search truck rolled in a cloud of dust preceding it. The sheriff Ridgway climbed out, boots dusted with gravel clipboard under his arm. He took down the basics in that calm, almost apologetic tone of a man who's done this too often. "Make, model, color," he asked, even though her Jeep sat right there at the curb. Mira's voice cracked when she gave the plate number anyway. I watched him glance toward the mountains, squinting like he could already see the trail cutting up through the trees. They promised to start at first light the next morning. That night, Mira couldn't sit still. She printed flyers on her old inkjet printer, the kind that left streaks across the paper. We walked door to door under the streetlights, taping Leora's photo to mailboxes and stop signs, the tape curling in the warm air. People came out in slippers to take a flyer, nodding solemnly. Small towns know how to grieve early. At dawn, the sheriff's SUV turned onto the dirt road toward Shadow Ridge, followed by a line of trucks carrying volunteers' dogs and coffee thermoses balanced on dashboards. I rode along with Mira. She insisted on being there. The sky was that crisp, impossible blue you only see at 75 degrees before the heat sets in. Leora's Jeep was parked neatly beside the trailhead kiosk. Inside were small ghosts of routine, a half-full water bottle, a granola wrapper, a folded postcard addressed to her mother, postage stamp already licked, but never sent. Wildflowers exploding at red. Home for dinner. They fanned out in pairs, calling her name in voices that started confident and turned raw by noon. The dogs nosed the ferns, then the creek, then circled back. Near the second-mile marker, a tracker knelt, pointed at a faint tread from a boot sole Merrill brand size 7. Another half-mile up, they found the core of an apple browned at the edges but not yet shriveled. Beyond that, the ground went blank. Ridgway marked the spot on his map, drawing a tight circle, then 2 lines the left path toward the overlook, the right down into a gully heavy with underbrush. She knew this trail, he said, to no one in particular, so why leave it? The first night of searching ended with camp lanterns glowing like low stars along the gravel lot. Coffee boiled on a camp stove, and the radios crackled with static and fatigue. Mira refused to go home. She sat on the tailgate of my truck, her elbows on her knees, staring toward the tree line. Around midnight, the forest went utterly still, the way it does before weather changes. I heard her whisper something then, maybe a prayer, maybe her daughter's name. I didn't ask. Over the next few days, the search grew into a living organism. Maps spread across folding tables, circles drawn and redrawn, helicopters sweeping the ridgelines with white beams that pierced the canopy like searchlights over water. Reporters from Missoula came out with cameras and rain ponchos, asking questions no one wanted to answer on record. Experienced hiker, local girl, they said. Could be an animal, could be a fall. Mira stayed composed on camera. She said, "My daughter knows these mountains better than anyone. She's out there somewhere." Afterward, when the crew left, she turned to me and said quietly, "I don't feel her out there." Rumors started to ripple through the valley, as they always do. Someone mentioned seeing a dark pickup near the trailhead that morning, parked too long. Another swore they heard a scream carried on the wind around dusk, though sound plays tricks in the canyons. A psychic called from Idaho, offering a vision of dark water and a man with shadows around him. Ridgway kept his focus on the terrain, not the talk. Each evening he came back mud-streaked and sunburned, his mustache collecting dust eyes rimmed in red. "Nothing yet," he'd mutter, flipping his notebook shut. By the end of the first week, the coffee urns were empty, and the volunteers were running out of hope to cling to. One by one they folded their vests, said they'd return if called. The forest had swallowed its noise again. I remember the last day of the official search. The helicopters grounded the dogs loaded into crates, the map rolled up and tucked under Ridgway's arm. He told Mira they'd leave it listed as open that weather, or time might still give them an answer. Then he removed his hat and said the words, "No mother wants arranged," in a sentence, probable misadventure. That night, after everyone left, Mira and I stood at the trailhead alone. The evening had gone cool, the pines leaking that sharp resin scent that rises after heat. Her daughter's Jeep was gone now, towed for processing, leaving an oil mark in the dust. She placed her palm over it, tracing an invisible outline, as if to memorize the shape. "She promised dinner," she said softly. She never breaks promises. The only light came from my headlights, and the thin glow of the search tent still half collapsed. We stayed until the air went cold enough to hurt. In the weeks that followed, life in Hamilton moved like nothing had happened. The rodeo banners came down. The market returned to selling peaches and zucchini. People waved at us from their porches, but their eyes slid away too quickly. Mira stopped working at the library. She said the quiet there was unbearable. Her house filled with papers, maps, and notes pinned to corkboards, each red line tracing a new theory. Every morning she drove to the ranger station with coffee for the staff, asking if anyone had heard of new tracks or found clothing. They hadn't. I think some of them started avoiding the front desk when they saw her car pull in. By September, the first snow dusted the ridgetops, sealing the trails for the season. Mira sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by flyers gone soft with handling. She circled dates, calls, dead leads. I dropped by one evening and found her staring at the phone, the TV flickering blue against her face. "I can't let it end like this," she said. "They'll forget her." I promised her they wouldn't, though. Even then I could feel the story slipping from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. The years that followed wore us both thin in different ways. She chased sightings that fizzled a waitress in Idaho, with Leora's smile, a hiker near Kalispell who swore he'd heard a woman singing on a foggy morning. Each turned to dust. She attended every memorial the town held for missing persons, her hands folded tight, lips pressed together. I covered those vigils on the radio, trying to keep my voice steady, as I said her name again and again. By the 10th year, hope had calcified into ritual. Mira lit a candle every July 12th at the window, a small beacon that glowed long past midnight. I sometimes joined her, both of us listening to the crickets outside, saying little. It wasn't faith anymore, it was habit, and habit was what kept her breathing. 2 decades slipped by like that. Then one spring morning in 2024, a call came through my station line asking if I still knew how to reach her. It was a young ranger from a maintenance crew clearing winter debris along an unmarked ravine off Shadow Ridge. He'd found a backpack wedged beneath a fallen log, weathered but intact. I wrote down every word as he spoke initials on a keychain, a faded map, a notebook with the pages warped from damp. My pen stalled when he said, "The name inside is Leora." That afternoon, I drove the same dirt road I'd driven 23 years earlier. Mira was already there, standing behind the caution tape, hands folded over her chest like she was holding herself together. The pack sat on a folding table under a tarp. It wasn't much to look at: faded canvas seams, frayed zippers corroded. But she recognized it instantly. The ranger, a quiet kid with sunburn on his neck, pointed to a small engraving on the metal of a pocket knife they'd found tucked inside 3 letters carved deep enough to outlast time. "TWW," he said. The initials meant nothing to us then. As the investigators took photographs, the light slipped low across the ridge and painted everything the color of old bone. Mira reached out once, almost touching the pack, then stopped herself. She carried that everywhere, she whispered. The forest, which had been silent for so many years, seemed to breathe again around us, branches shifting, a crow calling far off, the steady hum of the creek working its way down the rocks. It was as if the land itself was exhaling a secret it had held too long. Later, as we drove back toward town, Mira stared out the window, her voice barely audible over the gravel under the tires. "Maybe now she can come home," she said. I didn't answer. The stars were beginning to come out over the peaks, one by one, faint and patient. Somewhere ahead of us, headlights from another car dipped around a bend and disappeared into the dark. And for the first time in years, I felt that quiet start to move again. Not peace exactly, but motion, the kind that means a story once buried is about to surface. The days after that discovery blurred into a rhythm of waiting rooms, phone calls, and careful voices. The sheriff's office brought in the state detectives, and for the first time in years, that old case file was opened wide enough for new air to get in. I remember the smell in that small conference room, old paper and fresh coffee, a hum from the overhead light that buzzed just enough to make the silence heavier. Mira sat beside me, hands in her lap, the silver ring spinning slow around her finger. Across from us, Detective Silas Crow looked over the worn photos of Leora's Jeep, the trailhead, the boot print they'd cataloged all those years ago. When he spoke, his tone carried the wear of someone who's seen too many half-answers. The backpack wasn't on the trail, he said. It was 2 miles east down in country. Nobody hikes by accident. That line hung there a while. Nobody hikes by accident. The map on the wall showed a tangle of ridges, streams, and ravines that looked like veins under thin skin. He pointed with his pen, tracing the main route, and then the gully where the maintenance crew had found the pack wedged beneath a downed log. "We don't know how long it's been there," he said. "Could have shifted downhill during a storm, but I don't think so." His glance toward Mira was quiet, but certain. I could feel her breath catch the kind of breath that holds both relief and dread, proof she'd been right to keep hoping, proof that hope might hurt more than it heals. They took the pack to the state lab in Helena, bagged and sealed like any other piece of evidence, but to Mira it was sacred. She'd given them permission, though her eyes followed it as it left the room. A week later, Crow called me. He'd been trying to reach her, but couldn't get through, and he didn't want her hearing details secondhand. He said the lab had found traces of blood inside the pack, lining faint but there. It matched Leora's DNA from an old hairbrush Mira had given them back in 2001. He paused, then added that the team had found a small knife in the side pocket. I wrote the words as he said them, rust on the hinge. Initials TWW, 3 letters carved by hand. He said they'd run it through every system they had. That night, I drove to Mira's house with 2 cups of coffee I knew neither of us would drink. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been standing on the other side waiting for the sound. I told her what the detective had told me, choosing my words, the way you pick a safe step on ice. She didn't speak for a long time, just looked out toward the porch light, the one that had burned every night for 23 years. TWW, she said, finally repeating it under her breath like it might reveal itself if she shaped it slow enough. Someone made that. Someone carried it. Within a few days, Crow's team tracked the engraving to a local blacksmith who remembered doing custom work for rangers back around the turn of the millennium. There weren't many initials that fit, and the name that surfaced wasn't unfamiliar in Ravalli County. Thorne Whitaker, retired park ranger. He'd been on staff during the time of the original search, but his file listed him as off-duty that week. It sounded routine, but Crow had a habit of pulling at threads until they turned into rope. He drove out to Whitaker's cabin one afternoon, a place tucked into the timber north of Stevensville, the kind of home built by hands that preferred quiet. Later that evening, Crow called me from his truck, voice low, the way men sound when they've just seen something they can't unsee. He denied it at first, he said, but his hands were shaking before I finished my question. Whitaker was in his 70s by then, gray stubble skin like sun-cracked leather. Crow had shown him a photo of the knife, and the old ranger's face drained of color. He'd admitted to owning it once, said it must have gone missing years ago. But the story changed when Crow mentioned the initials carved in the hilt. A long silence, then a single sentence that cracked open 2 decades of quiet. I was up there that day. When Crow told Mira, she didn't speak. She just leaned forward in her chair, one hand pressed to her chest, like she was holding her heart in place. The detective explained that Whitaker had been doing an unsanctioned patrol that afternoon, scanning the ridge with binoculars for poachers. From his vantage, he'd seen Leora on the trail below, alone pausing near the overlook. A second figure appeared, male, moving from the tree line. Crow said Whitaker described it as an argument that turned fast. The man grabbed her arm. She tried to break free. He struck her. The rest of what he said came out in fragments, dragging underbrush silence. Whitaker admitted he hadn't gone down right away. Said fear froze him that by the time he descended, both were gone, and he told himself it was a misunderstanding, maybe hikers who'd left together. He never reported it. 23 years he kept that to himself, watching the same mother hand out flyers year after year. I couldn't decide what was worse, the act or the silence that followed it. Crow's next words were quieter still. He knew the man. His brother, Vance. That name landed like a thud in the room. Vance Whitaker. The younger brother, locals knew him from bar fights and unpaid debts, a man who drifted between seasonal jobs and trouble. Turns out he'd been living rough in those woods that summer, squatting in an old trapper's lean-to. The rangers had already tagged for removal. Thorne said they'd argued that morning about it, that Vance had been paranoid talking about settling a score with some hiker who kept reporting illegal camps and snares. Crow's pen stopped moving when he reached that part of the confession. Leora, he said she was that hiker. When the search teams went back out to the ridge, they weren't hoping anymore, they were confirming. Ranger Cale Draven led the group, a wiry man with a calm that came from too many recoveries in hard country. I followed them as far as the first mile marker before the terrain got too rough. The forest had grown thicker since the last time I'd been there, moss climbing the trunks like quiet evidence of time. The team worked in slow grids, radios crackling, boots sinking in soft loam. Around midday, one of the dogs went rigid, nose pressed against a cluster of stones arranged in a deliberate mound. The air changed. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. They pulled back the moss layer, the first shovel-strike landing with a dull sound. Beneath it, bone, pale and smooth as porcelain. It took the rest of the day to uncover what had been hidden skeletal remains folded in on themselves, the soil stained darker where time had mixed with decay. Draven called for the pathologist, and within hours, a helicopter lifted in Dr. Erin Voss and her team. The field tent they built over the site glowed like a lantern in the dim woods. Every movement from that point on was careful, reverent. The bones told what words could not. Fractures to the skull and ribs patterns that matched blunt trauma rather than a fall. The evidence of a violent end was plain. Voss worked with quiet authority, her voice, even as she called out each finding to her assistant. Crow stood nearby, taking it in without comment, his jaw tight enough to tremble. When he met my eyes, I saw in his face the same conflict that had haunted Mira all these years, the relief of truth and the ruin it leaves behind. By the time the remains were secured and flown out, the sun had sunk behind the ridge, turning the treetops the color of blood and rust. I stayed behind with Draven while the others cleared the site. We didn't speak. The only sound was the creek below swollen with snowmelt and a single owl starting its call too early. Draven finally broke the silence. "She fought," he said softly. "You can see it in the injuries. She didn't go easy." Back in town, Mira received the official confirmation 3 days later. I was there when the detective handed her the folder his voice measured as he said her daughter's name. She pressed it to her chest, eyes closed, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But she didn't. She straightened her shoulders, thanked him, and asked only one question. Was she alone? Crow told her what Thorne had confessed about his brother's attack, about his own cowardice in the face of it. Mira nodded once, tears running down in silence. Then she wasn't forgotten, she said. She was seen. The story reached the news by the following morning, local first, then national. Cold case cracked, after 23 years. People called into my station all day, leaving messages of sympathy, outrage, disbelief. Some wanted to help. Others wanted to dissect every detail. I filtered them, protected Mira from most of it. The truth had already taken enough from her. Thorne Whitaker was charged with obstruction and accessory after the fact. His brother Vance, long dead from an overdose in 2010, would carry the title of perpetrator in a case file that closed too late. Forensics linked the blood on the knife to him, sealing the story with science. But what lingered wasn't the evidence. It was the image of that ridge of a man watching from above while violence unfolded below. One evening, a week after the news broke, I drove past the edge of the forest where the trailhead sign still leaned against its post. Someone had left wildflowers there and a small wooden cross tied with twine. The wind picked up just enough to stir the petals, and for a second, it looked like they were waving. I parked, stepped out, and listened to the same mountains that had held her silence for so long. They didn't feel as endless as they used to. They felt alive, aware, almost remorseful. When I got home that night, my voicemail light was blinking. It was Mira's voice. She didn't say much, just that she'd been to the gravesite, that the stone was simple, her name, and the years nothing more. "She fought," Mira said quietly. "That's enough." Then the message clicked off. I sat there a long time after the house dark around me, thinking about those initials carved into the knife and how 3 letters could bridge decades. Truth had surfaced at last, but it carried the weight of every year it took to reach daylight. And though the investigation was officially over, something in me knew. The forest still held one more secret. something small, overlooked, waiting in the dirt for the right eyes to find it. After the arrests, the town went quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of quiet we'd lived with before. This one carried an echo, a weight, as if the mountains themselves had been holding their breath and were now exhaling all at once. Folks didn't talk much about the Whitakers anymore, though everyone had an opinion. Thorne was out on bail, confined to his cabin, while the lawyers and the state worked out what his confession meant. The headlines faded from national news and settled back into our valley like a low fog. But Detective Crow didn't stop. He was a man who didn't like loose ends, and there were still plenty of those. One morning he called to ask if I'd come with him and Ranger Cale Draven back up to Shadow Ridge. He wanted to walk the ground himself, see the angles, the lines of sight, the way sound carried across the ravine. It was early fall, the air sharp with that first bite of cold, and the forest floor was soft with shed needles. The trailhead looked the same as it had 20 years earlier, except for the fresh ribbon of police tape hanging limp on one post. We moved slow, stopping where the incline shifted or the canopy broke open. Draven carried a map rolled under one arm, marking each step against what they'd recorded in the original search. When we reached the ridge, he paused, pointing through the trees to a narrow gap that offered a perfect view of the trail below. "That's where Thorne stood," he said. I could picture it, binoculars pressed to his eyes, the whole valley spread beneath him, and that one terrible moment frozen in his lens. Crow crouched, studying the ground. He found the remains of a cigarette sun-bleached and crumbling, but still bearing a trace of filter. The lab would later match the brand to one Vance Whitaker was known to smoke. It wasn't proof of anything new, but it painted a clearer picture of how long the brothers had been circling each other out there, one watching, one hiding, both caught in a secret the woods had buried. We spent the afternoon combing through the slope below the ridge, tracing the line between where Leora's backpack had been found and where her body had rested all those years. Draven moved with the patience of a man used to letting the forest reveal itself in its own time. Near a tangle of fallen branches, his boot caught on something half buried in the dirt, a fragment of green cloth stiff with age, torn clean down one side. He lifted it gently, and I recognized the color before he said a word. Leora's jacket, the same one she'd worn in every photo from that summer. The fabric was brittle, but a small patch of embroidery, a stitched mountain outline, was still visible near the cuff. Draven folded it into a specimen bag, his movements slow, deliberate. "She fought," he said softly. "By the time we made it back to town, the sun was gone and the wind had turned mean." Crow drove us straight to the forensics office, where Dr. Voss met us under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was methodical, quiet, the kind of scientist who carried her empathy like a private weight. When she tested the fabric later that night, she found traces of blood along the tear, confirming what we already feared: Leora hadn't simply fallen or run. She'd been dragged. There was also a hair fiber lodged in the seam, dark coarse, not hers. It matched Vance's old sample from an assault case file that had gathered dust since 1999. The next morning, I met Mira on her porch. She had heard from Crow earlier and was sitting wrapped in a shawl, a mug of tea gone cold in her hands. The early light caught the silver in her hair, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she said, "So he killed her there." It wasn't a question, more a statement worn down by time. I told her what they'd found, the jacket, the confirmation, and her eyes filled, but didn't spill. "She didn't just disappear," she said, looking out toward the pines. "She tried to stop something. That's who she was." Crow's investigation kept unfolding in quiet waves. They found the remains of an old lean-to buried under debris just off the ravine, the kind squatters build from scavenged lumber. Inside were rusted traps, a tin can, and a folded map marked with crude X's. Draven believed it was Vance's camp, the same one he'd been using to store poached ginseng and game. Among the debris was a wallet, weathered but intact. Inside lay an expired driver's license with Vance's name and a slip of paper scrawled in unsteady handwriting. She saw too much. Had to. When Crow showed that to Mira later, she didn't flinch. "He thought she was a threat," she said, "because she believed in doing things right." It struck me how calm she sounded, not detached, not numb, but clear like someone who's walked through fire and knows the shape of the burn. That discovery gave Crow leverage to revisit old complaints about illegal poaching operations in the Bitterroot from the early 2000s. The ranger logs showed multiple anonymous reports filed within days of Leora's disappearance, mentions of traps near the creek, evidence of off-trail camps, smoke sightings in restricted areas. None had been linked to Vance before, but his ledger told the rest. Hidden in a rusted metal box under a rocky ledge near the lean-to, they found dried roots bundled in plastic, a small stash of cash, and a notebook listing buyers. The last entry dated July 2001, just days before she vanished. Next to it were 2 words: problem solved. When I heard that, I remember thinking how absurdly ordinary evil can sound when it's written down. Mira came to see the evidence herself, escorted by Crow and Voss. She stood over that ledger, under the sterile light of the lab, reading the shaky handwriting that had ended her daughter's life. After a long silence, she said, "He buried her like she was part of his trade." No one answered. There wasn't a word big enough to hold that truth. Thorne Whitaker, still confined to his cabin, gave a new statement once Crow confronted him with the ledger and the wallet. His face, Crow told me later, looked older than his years, pale and hollowed out by guilt. He admitted helping Vance hide evidence after the killing, terrified of exposing his brother, but haunted by what he'd seen. "I thought she'd be found," he said. "I thought the truth would come out without me." It was a small confession, but it sealed the last missing pieces of the timeline. By October, the mountains were turning gold and red, and the case that had begun in a summer of wildflowers now sat heavy in the chill of autumn. Mira decided to visit the ridge one last time before winter closed the trail again. She asked me to drive her. We parked at the same trailhead, the same lot where her daughter's Jeep had once waited, and walked the first stretch in silence. She carried a small wreath of dried flowers bound with twine. The wind was sharp, but the sky was a clear, endless blue. When we reached the overlook, she laid the wreath in the dirt, brushed her fingertips across the ground, and whispered, "You were right to care." We stood there until the light began to fade. On the way down, I found myself looking at the trees differently, not as scenery, but as witnesses. Every branch, every stone had seen something it couldn't say. I thought about Thorne on that ridge with his binoculars, the way fear can turn a man into a ghost while he's still breathing. Back in town, the district attorney announced that Thorne would plead guilty to obstruction and accessory charges. His health was failing, and the sentence would amount to house arrest. For Mira, it wasn't justice, not really, but it was something tangible to close the long open wound. She told me once that forgiveness was too big a word, but she could settle for truth. "Truth makes the ground solid again," she said, "even if it hurts to stand on it." The memorial service that November drew more people than I expected: neighbors, former search volunteers, even a few retired rangers who'd once walked the same trail. Candles lined the steps of the small stone church in town, their flames bending in the cold wind. Mira spoke last. Her voice carried steady across the pews. "The mountains kept her for a while," she said, "but they gave her back. That's all a mother can ask for." After the service, Crow pulled me aside. He said there was still one thing bothering him: a map fragment recovered from the creek bed marked with a faint trail that didn't appear on any ranger chart. It might have been part of Vance's route through the woods, or maybe an escape path he'd used after the attack. "We'll check it when the snow melts," he said, "but my gut says there's one more piece out there." That night when I drove home, the first flakes of winter drifted through my headlights. Hamilton was quiet, the houses tucked in against the cold. I passed Mira's porch and saw the light still burning just like it always had, but for the first time it didn't look like a vigil, it looked like welcome. Still somewhere up in that dark line of mountains, the unanswered question waited, and I knew come spring we'd be climbing again back into the shadows to see what the ridge had yet to tell. The snow stayed on the ridge that year longer than anyone expected. Spring came late to the valley, and when it finally did, the melt ran fast and cold, carving new channels through the same earth that had hidden Leora for more than 2 decades. I remember driving up toward Shadow Ridge one morning, the peaks still dusted with white, the air thick with that raw, metallic smell of thawing ground. Detective Crow had called the night before, said the team was heading back out to follow the last line on that hand-drawn map they'd found near Vance Whitaker's camp. It was probably nothing, he told me, just an unmarked trail or an old hunter's route. But something in his voice said he wasn't sure. I told him I'd meet them there. By the time I arrived, the light was soft and filtered through low clouds. Ranger Draven was already at the base of the slope, scanning the terrain with his field glasses. The air had that damp quiet that comes after snowmelt, the forest breathing steam from its lungs. A few yards ahead, the ground dipped toward a creek bed, narrow-shaded, littered with downed branches. That was where they found it, a shallow depression lined with small stones, half collapsed from years of erosion. Draven called Crow over, then brushed aside a layer of silt with the edge of his boot. Beneath it lay scraps of weathered fabric, a fragment of paper, and a single bootlace stiff with mud. The paper was a torn corner from the same kind of notebook Leora used, cheap cardboard cover, lined pages gone soft from moisture. There was writing on it, faint but legible, gone clean. No trace. Crow didn't say anything right away. He just folded the note into a plastic sleeve, sealed it, and looked toward the ridge. "He moved her," he said, finally, his voice low. "Panicked after the first search. It made sense the location matched the partial GPS data from her old pack, the one they'd found miles away. Vance had probably buried her there first, then returned when helicopters started circling, hauling her deeper into the ravine to hide what he'd done. It was the last physical piece of the puzzle. The report that followed tied every thread together, blood on the knife fingerprints on the map, the note in his handwriting. Thorne's final interview confirmed it all. He confessed to helping his brother rebury the body, terrified that exposure would destroy what little remained of their family name. He wept during that confession, Crow said, not for his brother, but for himself. The court spared him prison due to age and illness, sentencing him instead to probation and community confinement. He died that winter alone in his cabin. His obituary was 3 lines long. When the paperwork closed, the world seemed to move on. Reporters drifted to newer stories. The headlines faded from the front page. But for those of us who had lived inside the silence, the aftermath wasn't something you could file away. Mira spent the next months channeling her grief into something that looked a lot like purpose. With help from Crow and Draven, she started a small nonprofit called the Leora Kane Foundation, a fund for wilderness safety and preservation. It began modestly with donated equipment for young hikers and educational workshops about trail awareness, but it grew faster than anyone expected. People gave what they could, $5 here, an old pack there, because they recognized something in her persistence. She wasn't trying to erase what had happened. She was trying to make sure it didn't happen again. I visited her often that year. Her house still smelled of paper and tea and the faintest trace of smoke from her old wood stove. She kept one photograph of Leora framed by the window, her, in a field of lupine wind in her hair, a camera hanging around her neck. Sometimes I'd find Mira sitting beside it, the late light turning her profile to gold. She didn't speak much about the investigation anymore, but every so often she'd say something small, something sharp. He thought no one would care, she told me once, tracing the edge of the frame with her finger. That's how men like him survive. They count on people looking away. She glanced out toward the pines, then added quietly, "We didn't." That summer, a memorial hike was organized by the foundation. Dozens of locals joined, some who'd never known Leora at all, but felt connected through the story. The trail had been cleared and re-signed, the warning placards newly posted. At the halfway point near the overlook, a small bronze plaque was placed into the rock face in memory of Leora Kane, 1977-2001. She walked these paths with courage. Mira asked me to say a few words, but I couldn't find many. I just told them what I remembered: the sound of her laugh through the open window, the way she always waved from her Jeep as she turned down the road, how her boots used to leave small, neat prints in the dust by the mailbox. It wasn't much, but sometimes the smallest truths are the ones that hold. After the ceremony, I walked with Crow to the edge of the ridge, where the forest dropped away into the valley. He looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying too many unfinished stories. "I've closed a lot of cases," he said. "This one feels different." He paused, glancing toward the mountains. It's not just about what happened out there, it's about how long everyone stayed quiet. I knew what he meant. The silence wasn't just the woods. It was the culture of looking the other way, of assuming the missing were gone, by choice of letting the wilderness take the blame. That silence had cost us decades. The months that followed were strangely gentle. Maybe it was because the truth, however awful, had finally settled into place. There were no more press conferences, no more phone calls in the middle of the night. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm: morning news at the station, coffee cooling between sentences, the steady hum of traffic along Main Street. Every so often I'd glance up at the hills and think of her, how she'd once called them, her church, her classroom, her escape. They didn't look cruel anymore, just vast and indifferent the way nature always is. One afternoon in late September, Mira called to ask if I could drive her up to the ridge again. The air was warm and brittle with pine, the kind of day that feels like it could tip into autumn at any moment. She carried a small box with her light enough to hold in one hand. We hiked in silence, stopping only once to rest by the creek. When we reached the overlook, she opened the box and let the wind take what was inside, a handful of wildflower seeds mixed with a bit of ash. They scattered easily, drifting out over the valley, some caught in the current of air, some falling straight down. "She'd like that," she said, "a little color up here." I don't know what I expected to feel then, peace maybe, or relief, but what came instead was a kind of stillness, an understanding that closure isn't a door that shuts. It's a window you learn to leave open. We stood there until the sun dipped low and the mountains took on that deep, smoky blue that comes just before dark. When we finally turned back, Mira reached out and touched my arm. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting her fade. It's been years now. The foundation still run by volunteers who were children when Leora vanished. Crow retired not long after, though I still see him at the diner on Main Street. Sometimes his badge replaced by a paperback novel and a cup of black coffee. Draven leads safety trainings every spring, teaching new hikers how to read a map, how to mark their route, how to tell someone before they go. And Mira, she's slower now, her hair fully white, but she still walks the trails when the weather allows. I think she finds comfort in the movement, the way the rhythm of her steps answers back from the ground. For me, the story never really left. I still host the evening segment at the station, my voice a little rougher, my pace a little slower. Every July, I run the same piece, Leora's story, without music, without fanfare, just the sound of wind over the ridge and her name spoken aloud. I do it because stories like hers have a way of slipping through the cracks if we don't say them out loud once in a while. The mountains forget, the newspapers forget, but people can remember if they choose to. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and the wind comes down from the hills. I think about that first evening, 23 years ago, the porch light burning the moths tapping against the glass, Mira's shape in the kitchen window, waiting for headlights that never came. I think about all the nights, after how the silence stretched between us like a road with no end. And then I think of that ridge now cleared, marked blooming with wildflowers every spring, and I realize that maybe the light never went out at all. It just changed places. It moved from that porch to the trail, from grief to memory, from a mother's waiting to a community's watchfulness. If this story stayed with you, share it, not for views, not for numbers, but so her name keeps traveling the way the wind carries her seeds across those ridges. Because somewhere out there, in every quiet valley, there's another story waiting to be told. And the only thing that keeps it from vanishing is someone willing to remember.